The night the spotlight shook, the lights of the theater glowed like 1,000 tiny suns. It was one of those nights in Las Vegas when the air itself felt electric, thick with laughter, music, and the quiet anticipation of something unforgettable. Inside the packed showroom, every seat was taken. Waiters moved carefully between tables carrying glasses that shimmered under the stage lights. But no one was paying attention to the drinks. All eyes were on the stage. Because standing there was a man who had turned charisma into an art form. Sammy Davis Jr. Dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, he moved across the stage with a rhythm that felt effortless. His voice carried through the room like velvet, warm, powerful, and alive. When he sang, the audience didn't just listen. They leaned forward. They felt it. Sammy had that rare gift, the ability to make every person in the room feel like the performance was meant just for them. And tonight, he was giving everything. The band behind him followed every movement, every pause, every breath. Brass instruments flared softly. The piano rolled beneath his voice like a quiet tide. He snapped his fingers. The crowd erupted with applause. For decades, Sammy Davis Jr. had been known as one of the most talented entertainers in the world. Singer, dancer, actor, impressionist. But above all, he was a performer who loved the stage. The stage was home. And tonight felt like another perfect night. At least at first. In the front row sat a familiar face. Dean Martin. Dean leaned back in his chair, one arm resting casually on the table, a small smile forming at the corner of his mouth. He had seen Sammy perform countless times. But it never got old. There was something magnetic about Sammy's energy, the way he controlled the room, the way he turned every song into a story. Dean raised his glass slightly as Sammy finished a verse. Sammy noticed. He pointed toward Dean with a playful grin. The audience laughed. Their friendship was famous, two icons whose bond went far beyond the stage. They had performed together, traveled together, and shared moments that only people in show business could understand. They were more than colleagues. They were brothers. And Dean knew Sammy better than most. He knew how much Sammy loved nights like this. The music shifted into a faster rhythm. Sammy tapped his foot. Then he danced. The crowd cheered as he moved across the stage with sharp, confident steps. Even after years of performing, his movements were still quick and precise. Every spin was perfectly timed. Every gesture felt natural. But halfway through the routine, something changed. At first, no one noticed. Sammy paused for just a second longer than usual. Then he smiled again and continued. The audience thought it was part of the act. But Dean noticed. Dean's smile faded slightly. He leaned forward in his chair. Something wasn't right. Sammy's movements had slowed. Just a little, but enough for someone who knew him well to see. Sammy finished the dance and grabbed the microphone. "Now, ladies and gentlemen," he said with a playful tone, "I hope you're all having as much fun as I am tonight." The crowd applauded loudly. But his voice sounded different. Just slightly breathless. Dean set his glass down. His eyes stayed fixed on the stage. Sammy continued speaking, joking with the audience the way he always did between songs. The crowd laughed again. But Dean wasn't laughing. He had spent years watching Sammy command a stage. He knew every rhythm of his performance style. And something about Sammy's posture worried him. Sammy shifted his weight. Then he reached for the piano. Just for a moment. As if steadying himself. The band began the next song. A slower one. Sammy started singing. And for a moment, everything seemed normal again. His voice filled the room beautifully, floating above the music with the same emotional power that had made him legendary. The audience swayed. Some people closed their eyes. It was one of those rare performances where the entire room felt connected to the music. But halfway through the song, Sammy blinked. His voice faltered. Just slightly. He tried to continue. The band kept playing. The audience thought it was part of the emotion of the song. But Dean's heart sank. Sammy's hand trembled slightly as he held the microphone. He took a step forward, then another, and suddenly, the room went quiet. Sammy stopped singing. For a moment, he stood perfectly still under the spotlight. The microphone lowered slowly. And then, he collapsed. Gasps filled the theater. Chairs scraped loudly against the floor. The band stopped playing mid-note. For a few seconds, no one moved. The moment felt unreal. The legendary performer who had been singing just seconds earlier was now lying on the stage under the bright lights. Confusion spread through the crowd. Some people stood. Others whispered nervously. But before anyone else could react, Dean Martin was already on his feet. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look around. He moved quickly toward the stage. Dean reached Sammy within seconds. He knelt beside him. The bright lights made the moment feel even more intense, but Dean ignored the crowd completely. All that mattered was the man in front of him. "Sammy," Dean said quietly. There was concern in his voice, but also calm. The kind of calm that comes from genuine care. Sammy stirred slightly. Dean placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Hey, easy now," he said softly. Stage crew rushed forward. The theater manager appeared near the curtain. Someone signaled for medical assistance. But Dean stayed right where he was, next to his friend. The audience watched in complete silence. The mood of the entire room had shifted. Moments earlier, it had been filled with laughter and music. Now it was filled with concern. But something about Dean's presence changed the atmosphere. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't shouting. He was simply there. Steady. Supportive. Like a brother. Sammy slowly opened his eyes. Dean leaned closer. "Well," Dean said gently, trying to lighten the moment, "that's one way to stop the show." A few people in the audience chuckled nervously. Sammy managed a faint smile. "Dean, you always did like stealing the spotlight," he murmured weakly. Dean shook his head with a grin. "Not tonight, pal." He squeezed Sammy's shoulder. "Tonight, we're just taking a little break." Medical staff arrived quickly. They carefully helped Sammy sit up. Dean stayed beside him the entire time. The crowd began to applaud softly. Not the loud applause of a performance, but the kind of applause that comes from respect and relief, because the moment everyone feared was slowly turning into something hopeful. Sammy looked out toward the audience, still dizzy, still tired, but aware of the room full of people who cared. Dean leaned close and whispered something only Sammy could hear. "Whatever it was." Sammy smiled again. The stage lights dimmed slightly. The curtain closed halfway. But the story of that night was only beginning. Because what happened behind that curtain, the conversation between two friends, the quiet strength of brotherhood, and the moment that reminded everyone what true loyalty looks like, would become one of the most unforgettable stories in show business. And it all started with a single moment. When the spotlight shook behind the curtain closed slowly. But the tension in the room did not disappear. If anything, it grew heavier. Backstage, the bright stage lights were replaced by softer hallway lamps. The music had stopped, the laughter had faded, and the once electric theater now felt strangely quiet. In the center of it all sat Sammy Davis Jr., still catching his breath, still trying to understand what had just happened. A small group of medical staff surrounded him, checking his pulse, asking careful questions. Their voices were calm, but the seriousness in their eyes was impossible to hide. Dean Martin stood only a few feet away, arms crossed, watching. He wasn't speaking. Not yet. Because right now, he just wanted to make sure Sammy was okay. Sammy rubbed his forehead slowly. "I'm fine," he said. But the words didn't sound convincing. The doctor looked at him carefully. "You fainted on stage, Mr. Davis. We just want to make sure everything is all right." Sammy gave a tired smile. I've been on stages since I was a kid, he said quietly. Trust me, I've felt worse. But Dean knew that tone. It was the tone Sammy used when he didn't want people to worry. Dean stepped closer. You scared the whole room out there, he said gently. Sammy looked up at him. For a moment, the confident entertainer disappeared, and the tired man behind the legend appeared. You know what's funny, Sammy said softly. Dean raised an eyebrow. What? Sammy let out a slow breath. I've spent my whole life making sure the show never stops. He looked toward the stage curtain. And tonight I stopped it. Dean shook his head immediately. No, he said firmly. You didn't stop the show. Sammy looked confused. Dean pointed toward the theater. You reminded everyone why they came. A small silence followed. The medical team stepped back slightly, satisfied that Sammy was recovering. But Dean still hadn't moved. He leaned against the wall beside Sammy. You remember Chicago, 1958? Dean asked. Sammy squinted slightly. You're gonna have to be more specific, he said. Dean laughed quietly. That night when the power went out during the middle of the show. Sammy blinked, then suddenly smiled. Oh yeah. The memory came rushing back. The theater had gone completely dark. No microphones. No lights. No music. Just a room full of confused people. Most performers would have waited for the power to return. But not Sammy. He had walked to the front of the stage and started singing without a microphone. Just his voice. Clear, strong, unshaken. The entire crowd had listened in silence. And when the lights came back, the applause had lasted nearly 10 minutes. Dean nudged him gently. You didn't stop the show tonight, Dean said. You just reminded everyone you're human. Sammy chuckled weakly. Well, that's not great for the legend. Dean smirked. Legends are overrated. He paused. Friends are harder to find. Behind them, the muffled sound of the audience could still be heard through the curtain. They hadn't left. Hundreds of people were still sitting there. Waiting. Hoping. The theater manager stepped into the hallway. Mr. Davis, he said carefully. Yes. The audience, they're asking if you're all right. Sammy looked down at the floor, then toward the curtain, then back to Dean. You think they'll stay if I go back out there? Sammy asked. Dean laughed. They've been watching you for decades. He tilted his head. You think they're gonna leave now? Sammy smiled faintly. You always did know how to talk me into trouble. Dean shrugged. That's what brothers do. But before Sammy could stand, Dean suddenly placed a hand on his shoulder. Hold on. Sammy looked at him. Dean's expression had changed. It wasn't playful anymore. It was serious. You don't go back out there to prove anything, Dean said quietly. You go back out there because you want to. Sammy studied his friend's face. Dean wasn't trying to push him. He was protecting him. And that meant more than any applause. Sammy slowly stood up. He stretched his shoulders, took a deep breath, then looked toward the stage again. You know something, Dean. What? Sammy smiled slightly. I still owe them one more song. Dean grinned. That's the Sammy I know. But as Sammy started walking toward the curtain, Dean grabbed his arm. Sammy turned. What? Dean leaned closer. You don't go out there alone. Sammy frowned. What do you mean? Dean pointed toward the stage. I'm coming with you. Sammy laughed. You don't even know the song. Dean shrugged casually. I'll figure it out. The stage manager peeked out from behind the curtain. They're still waiting, he whispered. Sammy nodded. Dean rolled his shoulders like a man about to walk into a boxing match. You ready? Dean asked. Sammy took one long breath, then nodded. Let's give them something to remember. The curtain slowly began to open. The crowd instantly leaned forward. When Sammy stepped back into the spotlight, the entire theater erupted with applause. But when they saw Dean Martin walk out beside him, the applause doubled. Some people even stood up. Sammy walked slowly to the microphone. He waited for the room to quiet down, then smiled. "Well, folks," he said, "I guess I just needed a quick nap." The crowd laughed in relief. Sammy glanced at Dean. "And apparently I brought my babysitter with me." Dean grabbed the second microphone. Somebody had to make sure he didn't start dancing again. The audience burst into laughter. Then Sammy turned serious. "Thank you," he said softly, "for waiting." The room fell silent. The band leader looked toward the stage. Sammy nodded, and the music began again. Slow, gentle, beautiful. But this time, Sammy didn't sing alone. Dean stood beside him. And together, the two friends turned a frightening moment into one of the most unforgettable performances the theater had ever seen. But what the audience didn't know was that something even more powerful had happened behind that curtain. A quiet promise between two friends. A promise that would shape the rest of their journey. And that promise was about to be tested in ways neither of them expected. The promise no one heard. The applause that night seemed endless. The audience stood on their feet, clapping and cheering as the music faded. For them, the moment had become something magical, a legendary performance that turned fear into triumph. But behind the smiles on stage, something deeper had happened. Something quiet. Something only two men truly understood. Sammy Davis Jr. lowered the microphone slowly. His voice had carried through the room one more time, strong and steady. But inside, he could still feel the exhaustion pressing against his chest. The curtain closed again. The cheers outside continued. But backstage, the noise softened into distant echoes. Sammy sat down in a chair near the wall, breathing slowly. The adrenaline of the moment was fading, leaving behind a heavy tiredness he couldn't ignore anymore. Dean Martin walked over and handed him a glass of water. Sammy accepted it without speaking. For a few seconds, neither man said a word. They didn't need to. Years of friendship had taught them that silence could sometimes say more than conversation. Dean leaned against the nearby table and studied Sammy's face. "You pushed it tonight," Dean said quietly. Sammy gave a small shrug. "Crowd was good," he replied. Dean raised an eyebrow. "That's your excuse." Sammy smiled faintly but didn't answer. The truth was more complicated. Performing had never just been a job for him. It was identity, purpose, life itself. And the thought of stepping away from the stage, even for a moment, felt like stepping away from the person he had always been. Dean sat down beside him. "You remember when we first met?" he asked. Sammy laughed softly. "You mean when you refused to talk to me for half an hour?" Dean smirked. "I was testing you. You were ignoring me." Dean chuckled. "Same thing." But then his expression grew serious. "You walked into that room with more confidence than anyone I'd ever seen," Dean said, "like you already knew the world was yours." Sammy looked down at the floor. "Funny thing about the world," he murmured. "What?" "It reminds you sometimes that it is." Dean didn't answer right away. He understood what Sammy meant. The entertainment world could be brutal. One night you were the brightest star in the sky. The next night people were already looking for someone new. That pressure never really disappeared. It followed performers everywhere. Into every theater. Every stage. Every performance. And tonight, Sammy had felt that pressure more than ever. The hallway outside buzzed with activity. Crew members moved equipment, managers discussed the night's events, and the theater staff tried to handle the sudden flood of attention the incident had created. But inside that small backstage room, everything felt still. Dean leaned forward slightly. "Listen to me," he said quietly. Sammy looked up. Dean rarely used that tone. It meant he was serious. "You don't have to prove anything anymore," Dean continued. Sammy sighed. "You say that like the world believes it." Dean shrugged. "Who cares what the world believes?" Sammy gave him a look. "You do realize we're in show business, right?" Dean smiled slightly. "Exactly, that's why I stopped listening to it years ago." Sammy chuckled, but the smile faded quickly. There was something else on his mind. Something he hadn't said out loud yet. Dean could see it. "What is it?" he asked. Sammy hesitated. Then he spoke. "You ever think about the day the stage stops calling you?" Dean tilted his head. "Not really." "Why not?" Dean shrugged casually. "Because the stage doesn't decide that." Sammy frowned slightly. "Then who does?" Dean leaned back in his chair. "You do." The words hung in the air. Simple, but powerful. Sammy stared at him for a moment. "You make it sound easy." Dean laughed quietly. "It's not easy." "Then why say it like that?" Dean looked toward the stage curtain. "Because the hard part isn't leaving the spotlight," he said. "It's remembering who you are without it." Sammy thought about that. For years, audiences had seen him as a performer. A legend. An icon. But Dean had always seen something else. Just Sammy. The man behind the spotlight. The friend behind the fame. And that difference meant everything. Suddenly, the theater manager rushed into the hallway outside. His voice carried through the door. "Reporters are already outside," he said to someone. Word spreads fast. Another voice replied nervously. "They want statements." Sammy sighed. "Of course they do." Dean shook his head. "They always do." Sammy stood up slowly. He felt steadier now, but the exhaustion still lingered. "Guess we better say something," he said. Dean stood too. "Not tonight." Sammy looked confused. "Why not?" Dean grabbed his coat. "Because tonight wasn't about headlines." Sammy raised an eyebrow. "Then what was it about?" Dean smiled. "Brotherhood." They walked down the hallway together. But just before reaching the exit door, Dean stopped. "Wait," he said. Sammy turned. Dean held out his hand. "Promise me something." Sammy frowned slightly. "What?" Dean's voice was calm but firm. "If the stage ever asks more from you than you're ready to give." He paused. "Walk away." Sammy stared at him. "That's your big advice." Dean nodded. "Yep." Sammy shook his head with a smile. "You know I'm terrible at following advice." Dean grinned. "I know." Then he added quietly, "That's why I'll be around to remind you." Sammy looked at his friend for a long moment. Then he shook Dean's hand. "Deal." Neither of them realized it at the time. But that simple handshake would become one of the most important moments in their friendship. Because the promise they had just made would soon be tested by something neither of them saw coming. Something that would challenge their careers, their loyalty, and the bond that had carried them through decades of music, laughter, and unforgettable nights on stage. And when that moment arrived, the world would finally see just how powerful their brotherhood really was, the song that meant everything. The next morning, the city felt different. Las Vegas was used to dramatic nights. Performers fainted, singers lost their voices, comedians forgot their jokes. The show always continued. But this night had been different. Word had spread quickly through the entertainment world. Sammy Davis Jr. collapsing on stage wasn't just gossip. It was a shock. Newspapers mentioned it, radio hosts talked about it, fans everywhere wondered the same thing. Was Sammy okay? And more importantly, would he return to the stage? Sammy woke up later than usual that morning. The hotel room was quiet. Sunlight slipped through the curtains, casting long shadows across the carpet. For the first time in years, Sammy didn't wake up thinking about rehearsals, microphones, or stage lights. Instead, his mind replayed the moment from the night before. The sudden dizziness, the blur of lights, the sound of the audience gasping. And then, Dean's voice. Calm, steady, right beside him. Sammy sat up slowly and rubbed his eyes. There was a strange feeling in his chest. Not pain. Something else. A realization. For the first time in decades, the stage had reminded him that he wasn't invincible. There was a knock at the door. Sammy stood up and opened it. Dean Martin was standing there with 2 cups of coffee. "Morning, superstar," Dean said casually. Sammy smiled. "You always show up when the coffee arrives." Dean walked inside and handed him a cup. "I figured you might need it." Sammy took a sip. It tasted strong. Perfect. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Dean finally asked the question everyone else was afraid to. "How do you feel?" Sammy thought about it. "Like I danced a marathon and forgot the finish line." Dean laughed. "That sounds about right." Sammy looked toward the window. "You think people think I'm finished?" he asked quietly. Dean didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow sip of coffee. "Some people probably do," he said honestly. Sammy nodded. "I figured." Dean set the cup down. "But you know what those people forget." Sammy looked at him. "What?" Dean smiled. "They've been underestimating you your whole life." Sammy chuckled softly. That was true. When he started performing as a young entertainer, many people doubted him. When he entered Hollywood, critics questioned whether he belonged. When he performed on the biggest stages in the world, there were always voices whispering that he wouldn't last. And every single time, he proved them wrong. But something still lingered in Sammy's mind. "What if they're right this time?" he asked. Dean leaned forward. "Then you prove them wrong again." Sammy shook his head. "You make it sound simple." Dean shrugged. "Because it is." He pointed toward Sammy. "You're not famous because you never fell." He paused. "You're famous because you always got back up." Sammy sat quietly, thinking about that. The stage had given him everything: success, applause, unforgettable nights. But it had also demanded everything: energy, strength, passion, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to ask himself an honest question. Why did he still do it? That evening, the theater manager called. The next performance was scheduled for the following night. He spoke carefully. "If you'd like to cancel, we completely understand." Sammy looked across the room at Dean. Dean raised an eyebrow. "Well," he asked. Sammy thought for a moment. Then he answered the phone. "No," he said calmly. "The show goes on." The following night, the theater filled even faster than usual. Word had spread. People didn't just want to see a performance. They wanted to see something historic. Something unforgettable. The atmosphere inside the room felt electric again. But this time, there was also anticipation and concern. Everyone remembered what had happened the night before. No one knew what would happen next. Backstage, Sammy adjusted his tuxedo. The familiar smell of stage curtains and warm lights filled the air. For a moment, he closed his eyes. He could hear the audience murmuring beyond the curtain. Hundreds of voices. Hundreds of expectations. Dean walked in and leaned against the wall. "You ready?" he asked. Sammy nodded slowly. "Yeah." Dean studied him for a moment. "You sure?" Sammy smiled. "You made me a promise, remember?" Dean raised an eyebrow. "What promise?" Sammy grinned. "That if I ever needed reminding, you'd be around." Dean chuckled. "Well, here I am." The stage manager gave the signal. "It's time." The curtain began to open. The audience immediately erupted into applause as Sammy Davis Jr. stepped into the spotlight once again. But this time, he didn't start singing right away. Instead, he stood quietly, looking at the crowd, taking in the moment. Then he spoke. "Last night," he said gently, "I scared a few people." The audience laughed softly. Sammy smiled. But I realized something important. The room grew silent. I realized that the stage isn't just about performing. He paused. It's about sharing something real. The band began playing softly behind him. Sammy lifted the microphone. But before he started singing, he turned toward the side of the stage. Dean Martin stepped out beside him again. The audience burst into applause. Some people even stood up. Sammy nodded toward Dean. "This man reminded me of something last night," he said. "That the spotlight isn't the most important thing." He smiled warmly. "Friendship is." The music swelled, and together the two friends performed one final song. Not as competitors, not as stars, but as brothers. The audience listened in complete silence, and when the final note faded, the entire theater rose to its feet. Applause thundered through the room. Some people even wiped away tears, because they had just witnessed something rare, something powerful, a reminder that true greatness isn't just about talent. It's about loyalty, about friendship, about the people who stand beside you when the spotlight fades. Later that night, after the crowd had left and the theater lights dimmed, Sammy and Dean walked out together. No microphones, no cameras, just two friends stepping into the cool night air. Dean looked at Sammy. "You know something." "What?" "You still owe me dinner for saving the show." Sammy laughed. "Saving the show?" Dean nodded. "Yeah." Sammy shook his head with a grin. "You didn't save the show." Dean smirked. "No." Sammy placed a hand on his shoulder. "You saved the man. And sometimes, that matters far more than the spotlight."